Well, I gave you guys the opportunity to pick the next video, and by a razor-thin margin, you decided you wanted another option for the timeline, redirecting at 1005, where Wrath took the setting in a direction quite a few of you didn't like. I'll be cribbing a lot from this from the War on All Sides supplement I wrote a couple of years back for the Vaults of Pandios, which combined the Wrath of the Immortals and the Red Arrow Black Shield war with the Master into a single event. Plus, I'll be going off script quite a bit. So these are just suggestions, of course. They're just for your entertainment. So welcome to Mystara. I'm Mr. Welch, and today we're going on a new tangent. This is probably going to be similar to the Fixing the Wrath of the Immortals video I did, but quite a bit more in depth with what each nation does. The goal is to keep the status quo somewhat intact from the 1000 timeline, but still advance the nations logically. You don't want cultural stagnation, but you also don't want to nuke your setting. That never helps. Look at the Shadowrun game for a good example of a meta plot. It was always advancing, but never did it change so radically it didn't look like what the players liked about it in the first place. Summarizing the book War on All Sides, which I will put in the description below, it's a PDF and it's free. Wrath starts out, as predicted, with the death of General Torinol and Alphatia, Thyatis, and Glantry getting into it. Then the War of the Master starts almost immediately thereafter, but instead of just being a side note and him getting pushed back fairly quickly, it's a massive invasion like it was done in Red Arrow Black Shield. Darrakin is pushed back heavily and has to get allies from anyone and everyone it can get, and only after several years and a nuclear winter is the Master finally stopped. Then the rebuild starts. The biggest changes to Wrath is Alphatia and Alfheim are still kicking at the end. New Angmar has replaced the Broken Lands, and Darrakin and the Shires are half destroyed. So there's a few leaders dead, and there's a few others that were supposed to be dead but didn't die. So going to break down the new timeline nation by nation. Alfheim survives the war and doesn't get taken over by the Shadow Elves through some contrivances that you can read about. More on the Shadow Elves in a bit. They were involved in the war from the start, fighting in most major battles on the side of Darrakin. The Shadow Elves largely gave up on taking over Alfheim because they were giving a superior option. The new neighbor leaves Alfheim torn. They don't like the Shadow Elves still, but a peaceful option was found and the nation is safe. King Doriath isn't happened that just over the border from Darrakin is a Shadow Elf nation, but peace is maintained between the two of them. In the future, the fours start to merge and the elves have to learn to accept each other, so increased tension between the two groups staring at each other like bad neighbors, and then the magic force decides it's time for the two people to put aside their differences and grow towards each other. Advance the time enough and eventually the two elven nations will start to blur together as distrust will slowly dissipate. Alphatia survives the war but not intact. It didn't sink because of the Doomsday device, which never went off, but it is bloodied. Xandar proved to be absolutely incompetent compared to the Thyatian generals, and much of Alphatia's armed forces were obliterated because of his idiocy. Alphatia claims victory in the war to its people because they have forced Glantry to give up its forbidden magics, or at least not be open about them being forbidden magics. However, in reality, the Empire was knocked down a rung. Thyatis has seen Alphatia can be defeated, though the cost would be catastrophic. Ariadna starts looking for a new concubine because she needs a new heir. The heir apparent is beyond useless and her favored daughter doesn't want the job. But this leads to a new exciting possibility: Wizard Civil War. Xandar doesn't like the fact that he's not going to be emperor, so whoever does get the nod, he's going to try to overthrow almost immediately. The entire empire erupts into conflict between the loyalists to the new emperor and Xandar's forces. He might be totally incompetent, but he has supporters that need him on that throne, largely because they can control him by stroking his ego. Etrugran needs the most help of all the books. I'm still working on the revised Gazetteer. I'm on page 81 still, and we're still cranking. Getting that book up to the vaults is second it's done. But if you're keeping with the original Gazetteer, the Glantry meteor hits the side of the Etrugran plateau instead. Boom, the Etrugran are now part of the known world. Instead of the world elevator, you can work your way up to the now sloped side of the plateau. Etrugran have to deal with the outside world, with merchants and warlords looking on them greedily. The Horse Clan can raid villages like the Comanche of old. Have a final showdown between the Red Orcs and the Etrugran. There's not much detail to work with in the original Gazetteer, but at least they aren't isolated away from everybody else. The Tiger Clan gets elevated to major baddie and will probably be on the receiving end of a war or two to wipe them out by the allied nations, especially after they sided with the Master and went on to commit some of the worst atrocities in the war. The Broken Lands are almost no more because of the rise of New Angmar. The Master used humanoids there as cannon fodder, and the Shadow Elves drove out the ones that stayed behind. There's a small sliver of the Broken Lands that's left, but every day it becomes just a bit smaller because the force that's growing at a frightening rate. Thar's legions still number in the thousands, but not in the hundreds of thousands of what it once was. It has become almost a true roaming, marauding army where he has to ride into towns and villages pillaging and stealing to feed his troops. He's trying to carve his way to the northern lands where he can rebuild, but in the meantime, he's more like Pancho Villa's raiders, always on the move from superior forces trying to pin him down to finally destroy him. The City of Stars is still there. King Telamon did not like the solution given to him to settle the Broken Lands instead, and refused the offer that his daughter immediately jumped on. Turns out most of the Shadow Elves just wanted a homeland, and if the alternate option got them their homeland, they would take that. There's a few militant Shadow Elves that stayed with their king to try to come up with a way to drive off the Sylvan Elves since their original plan was thwarted. These Shadow Elves turn into actual bad guys. They hate the Alfheim Elves for the original reasons, and they hate the surface Shadow Elves for betraying their cause. They do get a win by discovering the lost city of Angmar and spending their time trying to conquer that city to have a base to get their revenge on their cousins and their kin. King Telamon then turns into a long-term villain striking from the shadows. Darrakan was the front line of the Western Front, and half of the nation is in ruin because of it. Because Darrakan is also a nation with a strong work ethic, and its people are very loyal to each other, the very first few years would have the nation restoring itself from the ashes, with tons of opportunities for player characters to get some titles of nobility. Think the Legacy of Blood module, but on a massive scale. There would be a large economic downturn immediately after the war, but every nation owes Darrakan money. Eventually they would get back on their feet, though the government would most likely be completely new faces as much of the previous administration was lost in the war. Ethengar needed a win. In the 1010 timeline, Mowgli Khan is a feckless warlord getting handed defeat after defeat, yet still staying in power. In 1005, they are literally the cavalry that saves the day by joining the battle against the Master in the last possible second and destroying the Master's largest force. So the Ethengar loot the baggage train and go home. Mowgli gets his win, and his troops are now quite well paid. But where do you go after that? Ethengar has the problem of being in Mongolia, except they're in the middle of the Himalayas. It's surrounded by mountains and swamps on most sides. That's not good for horsemen. The nation to the south is devastated and poor because of the war, and the next nearest is a giant forest. They can't invade Glantry, they've tried it before in the past. The only path to the nation is an easily defended bottleneck. So go off-map. Ethengar decides that the target of the invasion is Windar, the elven kingdom to the north. They have to go through a mountain pass, but there's little stopping them. Then you've got the next big battle. The Khan decides once he's taken over Windar that he's going to take down Dinagoth, the bad guy kingdom of monsters. Again, you've got to deal with more mountains because Mystara loves putting mountains everywhere. But then you've got the Mongol Horde versus the Shadow Lord and his armies of undead and humanoids, and you've given your player an epic war to take part in. The Five Shires was the site of some of the worst battles in the war. They are still in the process of rebuilding, and once Darrakan gets its issues handled, they're going to be right there alongside them. The Shires will have to redesign their government, as their committee style of ruling meant it was difficult to make decisions in the war, especially with the South Shire being almost completely overrun. But these are halflings. Once the rebuilding is done, they're going to get right back to not worrying about the outside world. Glantry managed to survive the war largely unscathed. Alphacia was turning its wrath on Thyatis, plus Glantry's magical arsenal puts even almighty Alphacia to shame. Alphacia sent an army of wizards and soldiers, and Glantry responded with a combined force of golems, undead, dragons, elementals, and everything else they could build or summon. It's still messed up beyond belief. D'Amberville is missing, and several of the other princes are dead. They still hate each other because of the peace treaty with Alphacia. They do have to hide their secret magics again. You can keep the storyline with Sin the Night Dragon, and Glantry is even more isolated now than ever, even more than the original timeline. They turned their back on their allies. They didn't help Darrakan even while the nation was burning. They didn't offer Thyatis much help in the war either. They do allow clerics on occasion, like in the original timeline, to enter the nation, but instead of trying to fight a plague, like in the original timeline, during the war the undead princes flooded the Alphacian lines with legions of undead, who then went wild in Glantry proper, terrorizing the mundanes after the battle was over. Nobody ever said Glantrians thought things all the way through. Irendi joined the war on the side of Darrakan out of a sense of guilt. The Master was no threat to them, but he was kicking the crap out of their allies. Finally, Irendi had enough and unleashed their vaunted navy against the Master's impromptu and ragtag navy. In a single week, the Master's navy was burning, all the blockades across the allied nations were lifted. Irendi is still a tourist attraction, though their warriors have been adopted as a mercenary force by the mainland once they showed what they could do. The nation is suffering a minor economic downturn as tourism is down sharply because of the aftermath of the war. Karamikos was a strange one. I wanted to keep the Black Eagle intact because he's a great villain, but I also wanted to give King Stefan his autonomy, even more so than what he had. So, promotion through attrition. Von Hendrix is offered all of Karamikos if he joins the Master's forces. He refuses, not because he's loyal to Stefan, but because he's not going to bend the knee to some 2-bit conqueror like the Master. So the Master decides that when he invades, he's going to make an example out of Von Hendrix. Because of the nuclear winter from the Master's meteor taking out a good chunk of Etrugan, The heavy snow keeps Stefan from sending troops west easily. Von Hendrix holds out at Fort Doom against massive numbers for over a year, long enough for the snows to melt and Duke Stefan to lift the siege. Von Hendrix survives, but his forces were nearly annihilated. The Duke decides since Thyatis refused to help him, they don't need Thyatis, also because of the assassination of Thencall, which was Stefan's friend, and he has no real close ties to Eusebius. Von Hendrix gets promoted to Count, giving him more political power and land, but no military power because all of his forces were killed in the siege, and the troops that he was given to replace them are all loyal to King Stefan. So now King Stefan rides off to help Darakan at the end of the war. Keramikos is one of the most powerful nations left, as all their neighbors were ravaged by war, and King Stefan acquitted himself well against the Master. Now what he does with his newfound influence remains to be seen. The Minorthad guilds were a tough one, because they had no reason to get involved in the war on either one. So they didn't. So they ran weapons to Thyatis and Alphatia, and they even helped Darakan when Darakan was starting to falter. They made a fortune in the war by selling to every side that they could, except for the Master. But when the war was over, the people were pissed at them. They provided no military help, they gouged their customers, and even tried to expand their territory on contested lands while their neighbors were busy. Minorthat's now quite wealthy, but they're losing customers at a prodigious rate to the rebuilding Darakan because of the bad blood between their former allies. New Angmar is the newest land to appear in the known world, replacing about 90% of the Broken Lands so far. This is the surface Shadow Elf kingdom, now led by Queen Porphyrial, who guessed correctly if she would give her people a surface homeworld, they would follow her without question. The nation owes its existence to several other nations who combine their magics to make New Angmar possible. The shattered ground that was the Broken Lands was terraformed in a matter of months into a giant yet oddly colored forest resembling the Camelbarth forest, only blue and purple instead of brown and green. The Shadow Elves found new allies in repulsing the few remaining humanoids that were left guarding the Broken Lands while Thar's legion was waging war in Darakan. New Angmar is still growing, but maintaining the Broken Land borders. The only exception is the narrow corridor of Darakan land between Alfheim and New Angmar, as once the Broken Lands are fully forested, both elven forests start spreading towards each other. The Queen is in a hard spot as she isn't trusted by her allies. Darakan sees her as a new trading partner, true, and the Shadow Elves have got a strange friendship with Vestland going because of the numerous battles they fought alongside together. But Porphyrial doesn't trust her father to behave himself as he pouts in their old city. She doesn't trust the Sylvan Elves to play nice and uphold their part of the bargain, and she's uncertain what the human lands truly want with her people. She's a stranger in a strange land, and what path the Shadow Elves take remains to be seen. The northern reaches you can take in 3 different directions, and you should. The nations represent all possibilities of what their culture can become, and you can take some liberties as well. Vestland joins the Western Alliance because they're trying to show that they are more than just bloodthirsty Vikings. Of course, they can still tear a chunk out of the Master's army because they might be transitioning to a more modern trading nation, but it doesn't mean they've forgotten how to fight. Eventually, Vestland might create a mercenary caste so their warriors can merge the best parts of trade with unstoppable violence. Solderford, during the war, decides to get a new king so they can rally behind him. Then they say neutral in the war because they're not in a position to do anything other than get stepped on by the Titans that are fighting all around them. Once the war's in, Soderfjord's new king has the unenviable task of staying king because the Jarls are going to want to regress back to their petty warring state. Osland gets the largest change by siding with Thyatis during the war fairly early. This lets you have rampaging Nordic warriors attacking ancient Egyptians on Thothia, just like in the Age of Mythology video game, or board game if you have that one, which I do. Once Eusebius becomes emperor, he of course betrays them by occupying Osland while the warriors are still at sea once the peace treaty is signed. Now you've got Vikings in exile, including the king, while the queen has to play nice with an occupying Phaeacian force. That's some opportunity for roleplay right there. Rockholm sees the devastation wrought on Darakan and decides to become a force in the trading nations. They can mass-produce items faster than anything, but without Darakan to serve as a clearinghouse for their products, they have to move everything themselves. So have the dwarves start to build underground roads to get their products to market faster. Not like the Underdark or the Deep Roads of Dragon Age, I mean actual tunnel complexes that are patrolled and maintained by dwarves and their creations. They keep their greatest inventions to themselves because they're dwarves, but they have trains and drilling machines and other automated inventions underground as they ship to dwarven enclaves across the known world. So Rain is hard to move forward in the timeline without damaging the city long term. It's a small city comparatively, so you can't cause a lot of damage or it'll fall out of the sky. You can make it part of the Western Alliance. They might even loan fighter craft to the allies in the final battle against the Master, just so you can have biplanes strafing juggernauts. But it does need to be largely left alone aside from the occasional adventure that threatens the city. Now, expanding where it can go can lead it to being used as a hub city that explains how the party gets from one country to another really quickly. Thyatis technically wins the war with Alphatia. They don't win it by much, but they do win. They have better troops, better logistics, and more importantly, they are much more disciplined. Thin-Call dies as he does in canon, and I said that anybody that died during the Great War was dead because the Immortals had made an agreement that they weren't going to bring anybody back during the war because it involved all the Immortals. But instead of dying because of an immortal curse, it's because of straight-up Ides of March treachery. His son Eusebius takes command after a brief power struggle, and shows he's not as good as a military tactician as his father was, but he is far more ruthless at the same time. He delegates the war to his military commanders and purges Thyatis of elements disloyal to him. Thin-Call's death turns out what would have been a decisive victory into merely a negotiated one, but Eusebius takes the opportunity while his armies are still bloodied to expand Thaetian territory into Oslan, parts of the Isle of Dawn, and grabs almost complete control of the hinterlands. Thyatis spares Keramikos because it's largely unscathed and would actually put up a fight, and Eusebius thinks they can bring Stefan back into the Thyacian sphere with diplomacy and reparation rather than troops. Yularim almost has no future in the official timeline. Seriously, I think they got maybe 3 mentions in the almanacs, mostly because they didn't give you a lot to work with the Gazetteer. In the 1005 version, they go through a large number of sultans for various reasons before the nation finally settles on one that can stay alive more than a few months. Fortunately, he's highly capable and recognizes Yularim has friends outside of its borders. So Yularim begins to help Darrican out after the war by providing large numbers of troops to patrol the Untamed Lands, so the untouched eastern part of Darrican can not worry about security and sends as much aid as possible to the war-ravaged west. Yularim softens its xenophobic stance of the previous sultans, and as a result they become much more of a common sight in neighboring lands. They still don't trust Thyatis as far as they can throw them, though. That's just a brief one-year rundown of all the changes I saw happening in 1005. Nothing earth-shaking, with possibly the exception of New Angmar emerging. The Cold War between Thyatis and Alphatia has burned off some tension, but they're still at each other's throats after it, and now they realize they aren't powerful enough to destroy each other, so you've got some fantasy mutually assured destruction going. The Western lands are starting to form their own alliance to counter the strength of the empires, which might lead to a third superpower in the known world. I won't go into changes in the Savage Coast or the Hollow World because this video is already running quite long. If the handbook does go into print, I'm allowed to make more books. I will launch the Mystara line using this timeline and completely retcon Wrath of the Immortals, which is something most Mystara DMs do anyways. Next week I am going to be at the North Texas Tabletop RPG Con with some of the icons of TSR that gave us art like Easley and D, or wrote some of the modules like Merle Rasmussen, so I'll hopefully be able to broadcast live from there if I can get everything working right and see how that comes out. If you're going to the con, stop by and say hi, and we can talk about anything you want, though you're probably going to ask me about Mystara. Letting you guys keep picking the topics for each week, that actually worked out quite well. Like and subscribe, and most importantly, share this with your D&D friends. It's the only way I'm going to get Mystara back in print for 5th edition. And educating people on the setting is the best way to do it. We're the least known of the settings, but we're also one of the most printed settings in D&D. We've got more video games set in Mystara than any other setting than Forgotten Realms, and our beat-em-ups are far superior to their beat-em-ups. So strangely enough, I've never actually played the Mystara Capcom games. I just never was a platformer. My weakness was pinball. So spread the video, like me on Twitter, and I'll catch you on the flip side. So until next time, don't nuke your settings.